The latest front in Donald Trump's shock and awe campaign to destroy the foundations of American civil society appears to be the nonprofit sector, with promises to target and go after the nonprofit status of political opponents, MAGA's political opponents, from environmental organizations to immigration advocacy organizations to Harvard University and organizations within the broader pro-democracy ecosystem. Of course, this is just more of the same from Trump, an effort to chill dissent, to stoke fear in the hearts of critics. And it's driven by this pretext that these organizations are not fulfilling their charitable purpose, right? These are tax-deductible organizations that receive charitable contributions and that do work in the public interest. They might not like it, but it's work being done in the public interest. And of course, that is pretext for an assault on political opponents. It is what it is. It's what we've seen across the board in all of these attacks. But underneath what he's doing here is another dynamic. And it's another dynamic that I think we see across these MAGA propaganda assaults throughout the years, which is projection. Because there is, in fact, a sort of a deep state of nonprofit influence and political machinations happening behind the scenes. Leonard Leo and the groups behind Project 2025 have taken great advantage of the nonprofit structures to be able to weaponize conservative ideas, as Leonard Leo put it last year. And of course, a lot of this is rooted on doctrinal foundations that Leonard Leo's Supreme Court put in place, allowing unlimited dark money in politics and moving towards the full constitutionalization of dark money, anonymous money that we cannot see the true identity of the donor behind. What we've seen in the nonprofit sector has been an explosion of this type of anonymous money, and they're increasingly being funneled, not just on the right, on the left, and across the political spectrum, through what are known as donor-advised funds. And almost nobody's heard of donor-advised funds. They're known in shorthand as DAFs, but they've become incredibly important vehicles. And to dig into DAFs and why we need so much more transparency and reform around these vehicles, we're thrilled to be joined today, first by my partner, the wonderful Lisa Graves, with me here at Court Accountability Action. Thrilled to be with you, as always, Lisa, here on Legal AF. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And our guest, Bella DeVaan, who works at the Charity Reform Initiative at the Institute for Policy Studies. Bella, we're so thrilled to have you join us today. You just released a big deep dive report, the first independent and fully transparent report into the explosion of these DAFs. Why are DAFs so important? How have they grown into such monstrosities? What's going on here?
Thanks so much for having me, you two. Really happy to be here. Donor-advised funds are financial accounts that are managed by nonprofits that are called sponsors. They're a really popular charitable intermediary that has absolutely skyrocketed in use. Most people, when they give to charity, regular people give directly. But wealthy donors who are increasingly consuming that share of the nonprofit sector in terms of ability to give, they disproportionately favor intermediaries that they can control. And they use private foundations, which I think are well documented and understood by the public. They're historic. You think about old Gilded Age fortunes. Donor-advised funds are an emergent vehicle that really took off in the 90s because commercial money managing organizations like Fidelity and Schwab realized that they could administer donor-advised funds as a part of their wealth management portfolio and help their donors get tax benefits, have tax advantageous treatment of their donations of non-cash assets, and then be able to give that money away to charity. Now, private foundations have a legal mandate to give away 5% of everything that they have in their coffers every year. Donor-advised funds have no such requirement, and they have also really different transparency guidelines, so donors can rinse their name off of any donations. They appear to be made just by the DAF itself. Many DAFs have tons of accounts. And so you're seeing them skyrocket in popularity because why wouldn't somebody want all of the freedom and autonomy that a DAF account affords? So by consequence today, really different than the 90s before these commercial DAFs really took off. DAFs take in a sixth of all American charitable giving, and they make up 9 of the top 20 US public charities. We think that donor advised funds are really underrated as a sort of site of influence in both, the nonprofit sector, but also in the sort of flow of influence of power and ideas. And the sort of like arbiter of facts on DAF trends and behaviors is a DAF sponsor themselves. It's the National Philanthropic Trust. I believe they're the second largest US charity because of the DAFs that they administer. And there's a lot of ways that their reporting kind of paint a rosier picture of how DAFs operate than what we feel like the public really needs. And so my team has some amazing researchers that can access electronically filed 990 forms and produce a sort of open source independent DAF report that's really looking at these accounts on a fair basis.
Wow. Well, the report is just fantastic. So definitely kudos to you, Bella, and to your team at IPS, the great researchers there and the data tech folks who helped make this possible. In looking at your report, one of the things that I found both astonishing and in a way not surprising given what we've been seeing is that something like more than $4 billion of the money that's going through these donor advised funds is then going to another donor advised funds. So when you talk about rinsing the names off or basically obscuring the money trail and following the money, like that is definitely a pattern. And we've seen in our examination at True North Research and Court Accountability how that has manifested in a particular way with Leonard Leo. And so you have this guy who was tapped by Trump to choose the people that he would choose from for the court, the Supreme Court, packing the court with ideologues to advance Leo's agenda and the agenda of Leo's funders. Then after 3 Trump appointees get on the court, the Supreme Court, Leo gets a massive gift, that $1.6 billion gift to the Marble Freedom Trust that then uses other DAFs, like basically distributes its revenue from investments through other DAFs that then give money to other DAFs, then give money to other DAFs. I think at one point we had 4 DAFs basically being used or groups that were operating like a DAF in order to try to obscure the money trail of who was ultimately getting those funds. And it's over $100 million a year being dispensed. And as Alex mentioned, with the purpose of weaponizing philanthropy to advance this extreme right-wing agenda. One of the things that we've seen is that for some of these Leo groups, they don't have a website. They don't have their own phone number. They use this one Leo Insider's phone number repeatedly. They don't have an actual physical address. They don't have sort of the ordinary things that a most nonprofit groups have. But they're using these other well-known names like Schwab, for example, as you mentioned, to basically move this money. I wonder if you could share a little bit more from your perspective of what you're seeing with what I think of as kind of a shell game.
Shell game is the perfect term for it. And I think you're absolutely right. Like there's an IRS guideline that nonprofits to merit their tax exempt status have to pass a public support test. That means that a nonprofit group has to have support, at least a third of its support come from the public. When you channel a donation through a donor advised fund and you, like we've been talking about, rinse the name of the individual off the donation, it appears to be coming from a 501c3. So that helps these groups that are registered maybe at a UPS store or, are run by a select few people. That really helps it appear to be publicly supported and merit the tax benefits that nonprofit groups like Feeding America, like your local food bank, like a really important on-the-ground direct services group need. And that chain of influence is pretty unaccountable on like a democratic basis. And it also, remits like a ton of tax benefits for the giver themselves. And in the whole process of, processing the Berry side donation and bringing those hundreds of millions into these different nonprofit accounts, there's been a lot of capital gains tax avoidance and other ways that these donors are sort of multiplying the impact of the gift. I mean, we could also talk about how these groups that are affiliated with Leo have sent money to Leo's for-profit consulting groups. It's just a sort of slush of money. And, the tax code itself stipulates that groups that have this tax benefit have to be publicly accountable and serve the public interest.
Bella, this is so helpful to have you lay out, and particularly this report is, I think it just is right in your face. It's undeniable what a monolith this has become. I don't know if it was your shop that put together the graphic. We'll put it in the show notes that shows the move in the money from donations to real charities to now, as you mentioned, 9 of the top 20 charitable recipients in the country are donor advised funds that don't really do anything except move more money around. I want to know what you guys are doing in terms of pushing for reform on this. I worked on these issues as a staffer in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it was a challenging and knotty issue because at this point in the game, we've got this as the status quo. Donors on both sides see real advantages to using these types of vehicles. They get the anonymity, they get the control that you described. We had quiet pushback as we tried to push for reforms to get rid of dark money in our political system, get rid of dark money in our nonprofit system from people on the left, progressives who said, well, don't do this because, the money will dry up and, people aren't going to want to give if they have to disclose their identities. And, from our perspective as sort of reform-minded pro-democracy advocates, while we completely understand the need of many of these groups to use the systems that we have in place, I don't think it would be wise to unilaterally disarm in the face of a dark money juggernaut on the other side. But how can we make this an issue that we could actually achieve consensus and reform on? Because my very strong sense is that there is pretty broad consensus among actual people about the desire to have an honest, transparent, charitable nonprofit system, and that these types of reforms to eradicate this type of shell game, situation would be quite popular on both sides of the aisle.
I love the way that you put that. I think that's absolutely right. And I think we can see the current presidential administration tapping into this, kind of righteous populist concern that these nonprofit organizations don't pay anything in tax. They are amassing huge amounts of money in their endowments. And there's anger about that needs to be channeled to protect and preserve democracy. And you're completely right that groups on both the right and left are using this kind of system to be democratically unaccountable. We think that a key coalition that's left out of the policymaking process is nonprofit leaders and workers themselves. We have identified a status quo lobby of big, DAF administrators, sponsors, and status quo foundations alike. They have different priorities across, the ideological spectrum, and they're in favor of preserving the system as it is, keeping regulations where they are. And they kind of drown out the voices of nonprofit leaders who are scrounging for donations and are looking everywhere for the revenue that they need to continue to provide, really, really vital services, especially right now. And the answer to that problem is that there's all this money that's getting stagnated in these charitable intermediaries that there's no political will in the current ecosystem to unlock. And so we think it's really important to be involving people who are in the business of administering, charity on the ground and taking care of their people on the ground in this political process. We think that donor advised funds need to have a mandated annual payout. We also really feel strongly that if they have more transparency than just the aggregate level information about the DAF in total, that could also help us get insight into the flow of influence in money. And then we feel like, this process should involve a lot of voices. It can't just be led by think tank scholars and the, wealthiest people. We need to be able to create a bigger constituency that is in touch with their politicians about this. So we're hopeful that, a bipartisan, cross-partisan charity reform package is possible. That's only possible if this kind of accountability isn't weaponized for any witch hunting purposes or isn't used to just persecute political enemies. We need to just really change the relationship between money and influence in politics through the nonprofit sector.
Yeah, that the shell game that we've been talking about, it, like you say, it is lawful under the current rules, which is why there is, I think, a need for reform and more transparency. One of the things that really strikes me right now is like you said, we're seeing concerns about charitable spending being weaponized on an ideological basis to basically try to use the IRS to attack anyone who doesn't comply with whatever Donald Trump is thinking on a given day, or who opposes on a principled basis an edict that violates academic freedom in the case of Harvard University, the decisions of private businesses as well as public entities by this administration that seems so determined to ignore longstanding rules, including rules that relate to protecting groups from being targeted by a political person based on their viewpoint, based on their position, their political ideas, which is a fundamental part of the First Amendment law in the U.S., that people have a right to have free speech. And that includes, under longstanding Supreme Court law, that includes nonprofits who have a right to make decisions about, what they spend on. But I think maybe this moment is also an opportunity to help educate the American people about the importance of charities, the importance of charitable giving, the importance of the nonprofit sector, in our society, in our economy. And so I wonder, what your thinking may be, Bella, about how to respond to these attacks, not by you, but by this administration, to try to weaponize the law in order to attack organizations, universities, and groups that are longstanding legitimate charities who've done nothing wrong. They just are identified as the enemy of the current political leadership.
That's such a good question, and it could be taken in so many directions. I think it's telling that the president invoked public interest in threatening, to revoke tax exemption. And I think that we need to just sort of remember what public interest is, rightfully understood. We've talked about the public support test. We've talked about the ways that you were just mentioning. Philanthropy in America is really rooted in this voluntary association tradition and the freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, values that we really hold fast and close. And I think that there's a really interesting coalition emerging of philanthropic leaders across the sort of like priority spectrum that have said, we really think it's important to preserve the freedom to give. And freedom to give is not the same as freedom to influence democracy and exert influence using money in our politics. And I think being able to draw a really clear distinction between those two things is quite important. And I think that there's actually a lot of, conservative voices who feel really strongly, like the Philanthropy Roundtable, which is a more conservative identifying group in the philanthropy world, has said that they don't want to see regulation being used as a sledgehammer to, use the state as a sledgehammer to persecute political opponents, that preserving the right to give is like a conservative principle and ideal. And there are ways that we can talk about that, from a liberal vantage point as well. So I don't know if you feel like that answers your question, but there's been a long history in American Congress that I think is also really undersung of different presidents and different groups in power trying to use whatever tools at their disposal to use the IRS to investigate or crack down on their opponents. Nixon did it. There was a lot of controversy around the Obama administration's IRS, looking into the exempt status of both organizations that used words like Tea Party and Patriot, but also groups that used the ACORN acronym or the word Occupy. And this is a long thread in American history where people in power, or, the powers that be, are going to have a different conception of what is in the public interest or not. And we just need to make sure that our democracy can, uplift like a plurality of voices to really define that, not just cede that power to the wealthy donors of the political power in charge for any given, regime.
Yeah. And as all of these institutions come under attack, I think it gives us an opportunity not only to recognize how important they are, how much we rely on them. And I think Americans will start to see that as they start to weaken, as the funding to these vital services and programs that so many of these organizations provide starts to dry up and people's lives start to get worse. That will come into stark relief. And then hopefully through this process, opportunity for understanding where things have broken down, not just recently, but along the way to this dark place, and what we can do to build back better, as I think maybe somebody once said. Maybe it was a former president. Bella, DeVaan, thank you so much for joining us, sharing your wisdom and your insights. Everybody, thank you for joining us here on Midas Touch Legal AF with Court Accountability Action. Please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Check out our work at courtaccountability.org and at Tilted Scales on Substack. Until next time, stay mad, stay motivated, stay mighty.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.